Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my 2024 LCS Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings video. It's finally time to get back into the LCS. This is the final Primer video of the major regions. Of course, we will also be doing the NACL either today or tomorrow when those rosters do get officially announced, but we've already covered all three of the other major regions, the LEC, the LCK, the LPL. They've all started already. You can check out those videos in the summer playlist up in the iCard right now. Of course, I highly recommend you do so if you're interested in those regions, but today we are going to be talking about the LCS. I'm super excited. One of the regions with the most amount of changes, I would say. A lot of teams stayed the same, but there were some major differences, and I think my power rankings are going to reflect that. This is not just a copy and paste of the spring split standings like it kind of is for some of the other regions, with not a lot of teams doing all that much in the midseason. I'm excited to talk about what has changed, what has stayed the same. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. I'm very excited, so without further ado, let's jump right into it. Some caveats to kick off this video. First and foremost, I have to say this at the start of every single video or else I'm going to get 85,000 comments, kind of referring to this, but at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. Big opinion warning. This video is essentially just my opinion. There are no real facts. These are all going to be personal rankings, personal grades, personal assessments of these players and these teams, and so there are going to be things you disagree with. There are going to be things you agree with. Both of those things can exist. It's totally fine if my opinion is different from yours, even if you think it's kind of ridiculous that I have that opinion. That's the whole point of this whole video. So that's definitely the big disclaimer to start. And I'm also going to throw up my grading scale on the screen now. We're going to be ranking not only all the teams from number 8 to number 1, not only all the players and their positions from 8 to 1, but I'm also going to be giving them letter grades. It's going to give a better idea, I would say, generally, of where I think these players land. I think some positions are stronger than others, and that's not always represented by those numbers. You know, you can be number 8 in your position and be as good as a number 5 in another position if your position is just stronger than another. And so I think these grades are going to help kind of illustrate that opinion. The other big caveat I would say at the beginning of this video is that I want to reiterate that this grading scale is incredibly flexible. I'm going to go through this and kind of explain what each of these letter grades mean, the specifics of it, but if I'm one off of your opinion, if I have a player at a B and you have them at a B plus or a B minus, we're probably a lot closer than you would think originally. I'm totally fine to move a player up or down one letter grade basically in either direction. I can feel pretty good about that. There are definitely going to be some players where the opinion that I give in this video isn't exactly the one that consensus holds at the current moment, but most of the time I'm probably only 1 or 2 letter grades off from what people would consider kind of the average grade for that player. And so trust me, I'm really not trying to disrespect anybody. I don't try to have bias on this channel, and so most of what I'm going to say is just my opinion, but if you have kind of a mover in one way or another, if you think I'm under or overrating a player, that's typically fine. I'm probably not going to push back super hard on that, but let's go ahead and talk about what each of these letter grades mean, just kind of in depth, starting with the A's. Anything in the A's is going to be an elite level player, a top 5-ish player in the region at minimum, right? Like, you're probably competing for MVP if you have an A grade in any capacity. A plus is going to be best of the region. These are players that are going to dominate their own region more than anybody else. They're going to be perennial MVP candidates. They are clearly a top, 3 at worst player at any given time, and most likely are top 1. I also should note one thing I didn't actually add as a caveat that applies more so to the LCS than it did to like the LCK or the LPL, is that these grades are in relation to the rest of the region. So you can be an A plus in the LCS and you wouldn't be an A plus like in the LCK, right? It's a little bit of a different scale because the talent level is definitely a bit different, but this is in relation to the rest of the LCS. And so if you're an A plus, you're the best of the region. If you're an A, you're a superstar. You're going to be a favorite for MVP. Spoiler alert, there actually are no A pluses in the LCS right now. A is going to be as high as I grade a player. I just don't think anybody has solidified that A plus grade, especially after how Spring Split went. But there are a couple A's, and that to me are players that any organization, any team would love to build around. They are likely going to be the best and the most valuable players in the entire region. A minus, you're still elite. Like, if you're in the A's at all, I consider you one of, if not the best player in your position, and certainly a player that could compete, like I said, for MVP. But A minus, just maybe not quite as dominant as the A's, or maybe not quite as proven as the A's, just still a really good player. And then once you're going into the B's, these are still incredibly good starters, players you feel very good about, even if you're contending to win the LCS. A B plus and a B, the only real difference between those two is how consistent you are. If you're a B plus, you're very consistent. You're a player that I trust is going to be good in most circumstances. A B player might have the same kind of highs as a B plus player. They might have the same kinds of great games. Their best games might look very similar, but they might have worse games in their bad games, if that makes sense. They might be a little bit less consistent on a game-to-game basis, and I actually value consistency very highly, which you will see in a lot of these rankings. But likely speaking, the B pluses and the Bs, their best games are going to look very similar. These are both, types of players that you can win the LCS with pretty cleanly. You might want them to be closer to your weak link rather than your best player, but it is still very possible to win the LCS with a team full of B plus and B players. We'll talk about that later. And then B minus is when you start to get into you're still an okay starter. You probably should be starting in the LCS. You're definitely good enough to start, but you might not be somebody that is expecting to contend for a title, or at least not somebody who is going to push your team forward in that direction. Again, I don't want to disrespect any B minus players by saying that they're just whatever, but these are good starters, not great starters. Starters that would likely be, the best player on the worst teams in the league kind of thing. And then once you start getting to the C's, it's where it starts to get a little bit more questionable. C plus is going to be a weak starter, enough traits or at least enough upside to definitely have earned a starting spot, to have earned an opportunity, but not someone that I think has proven much at this level, and certainly needs to show a little bit more for me to really believe in them as an okay starter, somebody who definitely deserves a spot in the league. Then once you get to C's, this is where it's it's borderline whether or not you are kind of a starting caliber player in the LCS. You've either not proven anything at this level, or alternatively, you have not been particularly good at this level. Those are kind of the ways that you end up getting C, and then anything C minus or below, that's a non-starter quality player. That's a player to me that has not only proven that they're not good enough to play at this level, but I don't project that that will change anytime soon. I project that that will continue to be a problem. We don't have to worry about that here in the LCS. There's just not enough spots for C minus level players to actually get starting spots in the LCS at the current moment. So that's the grading scale. Again, very flexible, and it's just my opinion. I really would appreciate it if you guys had the civil conversations down in the comment section below. I know some opinions can get people pretty riled up, but at the end of the day, if you want to leave a comment about how I've never watched the games and clearly I don't know what I'm talking about, I got a whole channel full of analysis where I talk about the games. And so, again, it's just my opinion. But with all that out of the way, that's the preamble. I know it's 7 minutes long, but for these primer videos, you really, really have to do that, or else some people are going to kind of take it the wrong way. I want to set expectations early. Last thing before we jump into the actual analysis, I usually don't ask this at the beginning of videos, but if you find yourself enjoying it 10, 20, 30, 60 minutes into this video, if you find yourself having a good time, enjoying the analysis, even if you don't agree, I really would appreciate it if you hit the like button. It really does help out the channel a ton. Again, I don't usually ask for that at the beginning of videos, and I would never ask that you like it now, but if you find yourself liking it, it really would mean a lot. So that's everything at the beginning out of the way. Let's get into the actual analysis. The primer video is, of course, the biggest LCS video I'll do all year long. These primer videos are my most in-depth analysis of all of these teams and all of these players. I went back and watched film on every single player that we talked about, not only the new ones, not only the new additions or the players that changed teams, but I went and rewatched everybody so I could give full analysis over this entire league, and I'm excited to share that with you guys. So let's get right into it. Of course, if you don't know the format, what we're going to do is go from number 8 in my power rankings to number 1. In my power rankings, I'll talk about all of the teams, all of the players. I will rank all of the teams, all of the players. I will grade all of the players, and I'll talk about how I think the team is going to play, whether or not I think they have upside to make any sort of run, where I think their floor and ceiling might land, just as in-depth of an analysis of these teams and players as you are going to get online. So let's start with number 8. Number 8 is not going to be a big surprise for anybody who's, followed the LCS really at all. I was going to say followed the channel, but really it's anybody who's followed the LCS. Coming in at number 8, in last place for me, it is going to be Immortals, and it feels very clear that this is the worst team in the league. In fact, I think they're in their own tier at the bottom of the standings. This is the only team that I really would be surprised if they ended up making even top 6. I just don't think they have that kind of upside. There are some interesting players on this team. Again, in an 8-team league, you are likely going to have at least 1 or 2 players on every team that are interesting to look at, but Immortals just doesn't have the same kind of firepower as a lot of the other rosters in the LCS right now. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. First of all, what you're seeing on your screen, of course, the spring split record on the left, the spring playoffs, how they did there. Of course, Immortals not making the playoffs and how that has changed their playoff record to where I have them in the power rankings. Of course, Immortals finished in 8th place, last place in the spring split. I have them in last place, so they're trending in the same direction. They're not moving up or down in terms of my grades. You have every single player that's starting for the team. Any asterisk next to the player's name will just denote that they are an import and that they take up an import slot. You have the number right below that, 7 for Castle, 8 for Armeo. That's going to indicate where I personally rank them in their position. So from number 8 to number 1 in terms of where I think they fall just in relation to the rest of the players in their role. The number in parentheses, either the equals, the plus, or the minus, is how that has changed from my spring primer video. I know that that's not necessarily always the best way to kind of look at it because some players can move up or down regardless of whether or not they've gotten better or worse, but it should give you an idea of whether or not the team feels better or worse than it did at the start of the year. And then, of course, the letter grade for the player below that. So that's what you're seeing on the screen. That should be the end of the preamble. That should be the end of me explaining things. Let's get into the analysis. Immortals lineup is looking like Castle in the top lane, Armeo in the jungle, Mask in the mid lane, Tactical at AD carry, and Ole at support. This is not a horrible team. We've seen worse last place teams in the LCS, but in comparison to a lot of the other LCS teams and basically every other LCS team that we have right now, they just don't have the same kind of excitement factor. There's really nobody on this team that I'm expecting to break out and become the one that pushes this team over the top, and I certainly don't think it will happen to multiple members. Even some of the other teams that are lower in the power rankings for me have some ridiculous upside if everything were to click. I just don't really see that in Immortals, which is why I feel very comfortable with them coming in last. Their best player, to me, is pretty clearly Tactical, and that's an unfortunate thing because AD carry, for as rough as it was in the spring split, there's a lot of teams that I think are really counting on their bot lane to be a lot better, and I do think there are a lot of AD carries that are good in the league right now. I think support is a rather weak position, but AD carry, I think, is a little bit stronger than maybe I expected when I went and rewatched a lot of the tape. I came out of spring feeling very bad about the AD carry role in North America, but it was a lot better than maybe I was giving it credit for, and unfortunately, Tactical is kind of a recipient of that. He's going to be the highest ranked player on this team, an easy B- for me, the only player in the Bs, but he is going to come in as my number 8 AD carry because, again, that role is just very deep. You can be a B- and be the worst in the league. That's just kind of how it is right now. I think a lot of ADCs have shown stuff, and so I don't want it to come across like I'm disrespecting Tactical. He's good at what he is, which is a player that can win you games and lose you games. Very volatile player, kind of actually drew back a bit in the spring split, wasn't nearly as like feast or famine as he had been in previous years. Even the first year he was here on Immortals, he wasn't nearly like that in the spring split, but honestly, I think this team missed that. They relied so much on their solo laners to be able to win them games. Tactical really wasn't like carrying in the same way that he was in 2023 for a worse Immortals team. If you can get that, killer instinct Tactical back, which I think is super reasonable. In fact, I think it's more than likely that that's going to happen. I think he will be the best player on this team. I think he will carry them to a couple of wins. I just don't think he's the kind of player that can be the best player on an LCS team and you be in a really good spot. I think that's my concern with Immortals. I think Ole certainly doesn't help. I'm really not that big of a fan of Ole at this point in his career. There were times with Immortals and Team Liquid back in the day where he was looking like one of the best supports in the league, but it's just not there anymore. I get it. He hit rank 1 in Korea over the offseason. People were really excited about him coming back, but it's been like 5 years since he's been good. I mean, there were some flashes on Golden Guardians that I think gave people some hope that he could come back here to Immortals and be a positive, but Tactical felt like he was weighed down a bit by Ole, and I think it's pretty clear to me that he comes in as the number 8 support in the LCS, a C+ grade, because I think it's possible that he becomes like an average support, and I think it's possible that he can at least exist, especially with Tactical here. I think they could be the 6th best bot lane in the LCS, which is kind of C+ caliber, but I really don't think their upside is much higher than that, and I think Tactical is worse because he plays with Ole, even if I don't think Ole is horrible. The other positives for this team, to me, the other big positive is Castle in the top lane. He was more of that feast or famine style that I think they were looking for from Tactical. If that's what Immortals became, just this team that was either going to beat you really fast or lose really fast, I think I would be a lot more excited about them, but really it's just Castle, or at least that's what it was in the spring split. Castle's interesting because he's very good mechanically, but he just makes some horrendous decisions, especially in the mid game. He's not really good at transitioning leads, even if he is a relatively okay laner, and even then, he's a relatively inconsistent laner. When he gets bad matchups, he loses them incredibly hard. I think Castle has upside. I think the mechanics are definitely there. I think if he was in a different org, in a different situation, I would feel better about him, but I just don't think he's the kind of guy that's going to break through on this Immortals team, even if he was probably the most interesting piece in the spring. And then you've got Armeo, Mask. I think both of them were just kind of to me in spring, specifically Armeo. We'll get to that actually right now. He was maybe the worst player in the spring split. He certainly was close, was just not a particularly good jungler. And the problem with Armeo is I don't think it's going to look better. I think he's the kind of player that's going to look really, really bad when he's on a team with bad players. Like, even if he's not the worst worst player in the entire universe, when he's on a team where they're not winning and the lanes aren't looking good, I don't think Armeo's the kind of player that's going to elevate that kind of system. I think he's the kind of player that would look excellent if he was surrounded by a really good supporting cast. He's just not here at Immortals, and I think that's really kind of taken itself out on his performances. He's going to come in as a C grade, the lowest on this team, the clear number 8 jungler, at least going into the split for me. He was the worst jungler in the league by far, and I really would be surprised if that changed. Again, a more supportive style jungler. He can carry too. I'm not going to try and sit here and pigeonhole him into one style. Was really good at the lower level, in tier 2 in the NACL for Team Liquid for so many years, but has just not really been able to make that transition to the LCS at a successful clip really at all. When he is playing with lanes that aren't pushing forward and, going up against these junglers that can just be more aggressive than him, there's really not a lot that he is capable of doing that is going to push his team over the top, even if I do like Armeo in other circumstances. And then Mask, the last player to talk about here. He was kind of the exact opposite of what I thought he was going to be going into the year for Immortals. When you go look at a lot of his tape, not only from the Challengers League and LCK, but from the ERLs on Unicorns of Love, he was a player that I really expected to come in and be more of a facilitative type of mid laner, pair up with Armeo and make a lot of macro plays around Tactical and around Castle as your two main carries. That's not exactly how they used him. The Galio specialist, or at least that's kind of what I knew him as before coming over here, was mostly on things like Azir and was definitely prioritized a lot more as a team fight carry. I don't think that plays into Mask's strengths. I think that's definitely moving away from what he did well, but there were some games where it definitely worked. I'm not going to say he's a lost cause or anything, but certainly an inconsistent player is not particularly good in lane, and I think that's definitely going to hurt. Again, this team's not very good in the early game at all outside of Tactical. And I think that's just kind of a death sentence. Maybe Mask's ability to team fight can really help this team in this meta, because as we've seen in a lot of the other regions, right now games are going a lot longer. There's a lot more opportunity to stall games out, and early game doesn't matter as much as it did in spring, so perhaps that's better suited for players like Mask and Armeo and even Castle to an extent, who don't really transition in the mid game particularly strongly, but that's just going to be a wait and see approach. I think Mask is kind of just a guy in the league right now, especially if they're going to play away from his strengths. Overall, there's just not really a ton to be excited about here for Immortals. Tactical could potentially get back on track, and there's a chance his stats and his performances look really good because he's going to be getting a lot of the resources here for Immortals just like he did in 2023, but I don't think it's ever really going to result in any sort of success, any sort of wins. I'm really hoping for some Castle and Mask development. I think that is the entire year here for Immortals, is seeing what you have in these two players and seeing what could potentially become of these two, whether or not Immortals is in the league next year. I think that's definitely going to be the most interesting thing to watch, but for what feels like the 800th split in a row, I just imagine Immortals is going to be another last place team. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, this is going to be, I believe, the final team to not make playoffs in terms of my projected, playoff standings, and I don't think it's going to surprise anybody else. It's the other team that missed playoffs last split. It's Shopify Rebellion coming in at number 7 for me. I do think they are significantly better than Immortals, and they definitely could make top 6 if everything goes well. There is way too much talent on this team to just completely count them out, but I do think there's a reason they finished in the bottom 2 last split, and I think I need to see some of those improvements come back. I need to see some of the drafting mistakes on this team get fixed, because it felt like they got really locked in on a particular playstyle and then ended up not really adapting and losing because of that. There are just a lot of things that I need to see from Shopify before I really believe in them, but the change that they made I think was positive overall, and perhaps a full split of these guys playing together could be a really good thing for the org in general. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Fake God in the top lane, Tomio in the jungle, Insanity in the mid lane, B-Boy at AD carry, and Zazel at support. The only new addition to this team is going to be Tomio in the jungle. That is denoted by the asterisk next to the number, just to kind of indicate. I also want to point out that -1 is going to be in relation to where I ranked Boogie last split, and that's going to be the same for anybody who changed teams. It's going to be in relation to who the starting player was for that team, not necessarily their own individual grade if they were to have come over from a different team. So worth noting, but I think a lot of these players are solid, as you can see from the B- grades that kind of populate a lot of this roster. I certainly think there are question marks and, players that have not necessarily performed super well at the top level, but for the most part, I feel good about this team, but the problem is they just don't have that star. You're hoping that B-Boy can become that. He is the player on this team that you are most looking forward to. He was awesome in spring, was clearly the star of Shopify Rebellion in the spring split. People were hounding this organization for bringing B-Boy in because because they were like, oh no, not another mid-tier import. I really pushed back on that in my spring primer because when you go and watch his tape from the last couple of years, it's actually really, really good. Like, he was really good the last couple of years, and so I was actually excited to see what he could be, and clearly he's made a lot of developments ever since he was in, like, the LPL and the LEC. He's clearly kind of grown a lot as a player, and I think this is the best version of him that we have seen as an AD carry. He can be an all-pro kind of guy. He was this past split. I think you're expecting some bounce backs from some other ADCs, and also, you know, players like Sven are coming back into the league. It's harder to rank B-Boy in the top 3 going into the split than it probably was, you know, the last split or something like that. Like I said, the AD carry position did get deeper this offseason, but B-Boy is a reason for that. You're getting a full split of him for Shopify here. He's going to be here from week number 1, which I think is good. Hopefully the communication has improved for him, and generally, if he can continue the pace that he was on in the spring split, that's going to be dangerous, because Zeyzal's certainly not a pushover in the support position. I don't think he was incredible in the spring split. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that this team lost a lot of pressure in the early game. They didn't really have any middle of the map pressure, which makes it a lot more difficult for the support, but they were good in the 2v2. I think that was something they wanted to prioritize clearly in terms of their drafts. They wanted to get B-Boy ahead. Zeyzal, I think, will fall a little bit more into that role as we continue throughout the year, but if he wants to get back to that engage roam style that he was really good at in 2018, 2019, that era, I think that's also possible. It's obviously Zeyzal. Like, we know he can do whatever he needs to do. His mechanics are never going to be the sharpest of anybody in the entire league, but he is an incredible macro player, and that's always been a big advantage for him going back to the Cloud9 days. I think the interesting thing, whether or not this team over or underperforms their expectations, kind of the swing point for me is going to be the middle of the map, though. Mostly Insanity in the mid lane. We saw two sides of the same coin when it came to Insanity. Insanity last year, of course, it was kind of an all-pro caliber guy when he wasn't even supposed to be starting for TSM. He was brought in essentially as this like last-minute decision, this last-minute replacement because they couldn't get Ruby in time, and he turned out to be way better than Ruby. Kind of pushed his way into that starting spot and was like an all-pro caliber guy when he played, but a lot of that was on weird picks, specifically things like Graves mid, you know, Sion. He was pulling out a lot of these weird, anti-meta picks that were working out and teams weren't exactly ready for it. This team doubled down on those drafts a lot over the course of the spring split, and teams were ready for it this year. And honestly, it made Insanity look like a significantly worse player. He looked a lot worse on Graves and Sion than he did when he finally just relented and went to start playing Orianna and a lot of the other standard mids. When he started getting back to that, he was playing a lot better again. And so hopefully that era of Shopify just overcomplicating the problem is over. I want to see Insanity be flexible, allow those counter picks to exist. You can play Graves and Sion if the matchup is worth it, but don't force them into comps that don't necessarily fit them. It's what we saw Shopify doing a lot over the course of spring. I think that will help considerably, but Insanity does need to be a top 5-ish mid laner at the very least for this team to really be competitive. They rely on him a lot. The middle of the map pressure that he was able to generate for TSM was why they were kind of surprisingly dangerous in 2023, and that just wasn't there. And that was to me the biggest reason why they missed the playoffs. And so Insanity, a pretty big swinging point, I would say, for Shopify, but hopefully the end of the split where he did start to play better is a good sign. Again, Tomio coming into the jungle, I think, will help. One of the things I am a little bit concerned about is Boogie and Insanity always had really good chemistry, even when they were playing poorly. They clearly liked playing together, and they played off each other really well. Boogie was somebody who really liked to enable mid lane. Tomio, definitely somebody who is going to take a bit more of the resources as opposed to what Boogie was for this Shopify team. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, especially if Insanity is going to take a lower resource role, which I think could be positive. And Tomio, I do think, is a better player than Boogie, even if he is going down one spot here. That has more to do with the fact that jungle is just a stronger position. Remember, a lot of players are going to slide down, quote unquote, in terms of their position rankings, if only because there are so many players re-entering the league in their positions. Licorice, Spica, Sven, these are new players. Like Quad is coming into the mid lane. These are new players in these roles that maybe, would have been ranked higher in spring already. So generally, these minuses aren't indicative of the players getting worse, but more the league around them getting better, and I think that's the case for Tomio. He should be an upgrade to Boogie. I would consider him a better player than Boogie is, and certainly has more upside. I'm excited they made this decision. I felt like it was a no-brainer. I tweeted that out in the offseason, but we've never seen Tomio play at this level, and so it is going to be, at the very least, cautious optimism. I have him at a B- for now. I think it's fair to give him a C+ if you want to give him that, because he hasn't proven anything at this level, but he's been so good in Tier 2, and, he's had half a year to learn under Boogie and to scrim with this team. He clearly has what they want, and they clearly want to invest in him. He's played with a couple of these players before. I'm not super concerned about Tomio. I think his floor is going to be relatively high. The one concern I do have with this roster is going to be Fake God, and I hate saying that because Fake God is kind of a channel darling. Like, he really is somebody that I've hyped up a lot in the past. He has dominated tier 2 at every single opportunity, whether it's in the 100 Thieves system, whether it's, in Cloud9 system, whether it was on Disguised. He has been given, a lot of rough opportunities, we'll just say, at the LCS level, whether it's filling in for Someday in the top lane because they need to start an import in the mid lane to even survive in that role for 100 Thieves, whether it's playing on that Dignitas team that was a complete disaster where he was scapegoated, and now here on Shopify where things aren't going well. Fake God's been given a couple of rough LCS situations, but last split was the first time where I was like, ooh, it kind of is your fault to an extent. Like, he's just not winning lane. His laning stats are horrible in comparison to the rest of the top laners. I think he can settle in. Again, I'm a huge fan of Fake God. I was really hyping him up coming into this split, or coming into this year. It just didn't really work out in spring, and I need to see more. He's going to get a C grade because of it. He's going to come in as the number 8 top laner because of it. I think he can get to around number 5 or number 6 if things work out at minimum, right? Like, he could be better than that. That's what we were saying going into the year. It's just not necessarily been there so far. So for Shopify, a lot of positives. B-Boy, I think, is definitely a positive. You're expecting him to be, a really good player. A B+ is a really good grade for a team that I'm not projecting to be in the playoffs, but everybody else has some level of concern. Zeyzal, I feel okay about. Bot lane should be a strength, but how are Tomio and Insanity going to play together? And can Insanity be a lot more consistent throughout the entirety of the split? Can Fake God just survive on the top side, be a lot more consistent as a 1v1 laner? These are real questions that Shopify has not been able to answer yet, and in a league where the talent pool is so condensed because there's so few teams, you just can't really get away with having those kinds of question marks and still being a top 6 team. So for Shopify, I still believe in them. I still believe that they can overperform this, but for now, this is where they're going to land. But then moving on now to number 6. We're done with the bottom 2 teams, the 2 projected teams that I do not think will be making the playoffs here in the LCS, and it's time to move on to a bit more of a controversial take here at number 6, at least in terms of how this team performed in the spring split. Coming in at the bottom of the playoffs for me, it is going to be 100 Thieves. This was a team that just finished 2nd place in the regular season with the exact same record as FlyQuest in 1st place. They obviously didn't do quite as well in the playoffs, but still top 4'd in the playoffs. They still won a playoff series, which is more than, some other teams that are above them are going to be able to say, but with some expected bounce backs from teams that I think are better than how they performed in spring, and also obviously with teams making some big splashes in off-season free agency this, summer. I do think that 100 Thieves is projected to drop down a bit in terms of the standings. I'm not sure how common or popular this opinion is at this point, but it's certainly one that I feel at least is going to be my expectation for the start of the split. There's still a lot to like about this team, and remember, they're way ahead of schedule. This was expected to be kind of a rebuilding year for them, and they've already been pretty relevant. If they continue that growth, if they continue to kind of prove themselves in the upper echelon, we'll have no choice but to consider them one of the best teams in North America. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Sniper in the top lane, River in the jungle, Quid in the mid lane, Meech at AD carry, and Ayla at support. The first thing that is going to jump out to people is we have the biggest riser of anybody in their own individual position in Quid in the mid lane. Very well deserved. The reigning MVP moves up to the number 2 mid laner in the region. He's only behind one other mid. I think you can probably guess who it is. I think some people are going to feel that a B+ rating is pretty disrespectful for somebody who just won the MVP, but to me, Quid has yet to really prove himself to be like a consistent split to split kind of star. He was super good on this 100 Thieves team in the same way that he was really good on Gen G Challengers when he was brought over from the LCK Challengers League, in that he really was the only player getting a ton of the resources early on in the game, and it did allow him to play a lot more aggressively, and he was really, proactive and really positive in that role. I think especially coming off of what was a pretty disastrous first split in the LCS in summer of 2023, it was really, really good to see him kind of break through and be an MVP caliber player. And then when you look at the differences, when you look at why that change could have happened, I don't necessarily think Quid got infinitely better. I think when you look at 2023 100 Thieves, I'm not going to try and sit here and say that Double Lift is a vortex in terms of resources, but he certainly is a bit more of a resource-heavy kind of player, if you will. We're seeing that in a lot of the teammates from last year. Busio's done better on FlyQuest. Quid obviously better here on 100 Thieves. Closer has had a really good start to his time on K-Corp over in the LEC. A lot of these players are playing better now that they're not quite as shackled to giving resources into the bot lane as consistently. I think Quid is probably the biggest recipient of that. He now gets to play as a bit more of a high resource mid laner, which is always what I think he has preferred. It was what he was in the Challengers League. I'm not sure that's a style that I think would be perfect on every team. I think it works for 100 Thieves because Meech has really shown to be such a good low resource AD carry, and Sniper prefers to 1v1. He doesn't really like a lot of intervention on the top side, and River wants to give resources somewhere, and so Quib ends up being the one that they play through, but that generally is just the way that it works for 100 Thieves. I think on a different team, perhaps Quid wouldn't be quite as successful, but I think he fits really well in the playstyle here for 100 T. That's not to say that he's bad by any means. Number 2 in terms of mid laners is not meant to be an insult by any means. I'm certainly not trying to undersell him. Mechanically speaking, he made a ton of consistency improvements in the spring split. I just want to see him be able to win a little bit more 1v1 as opposed to River just camping mid lane over and over again until Quid gets a lead, which is what a lot of spring split was. Still value him highly because he did a lot with those resources, but I don't know if I'm quite willing to call him an A-graded player just yet. River definitely helps. Having him in the jungle certainly makes things a lot easier. He's going to come in as my number 3 jungler. I think this, again, is a pretty fair way to rank him. Some people are going to want him higher. I don't think anybody's really going to want him lower than this. Again, maybe some people want him as an A. Maybe some people want him as an A- like kind of player. I think that that's pretty valid. He has been super consistent. I was a bit concerned going into the year that River was not going to be able to follow up that Golden Guardians year with something just as valuable, but he has been invaluable to this team, to this young roster as the veteran shot caller over the course of this year. I think a lot has been made out of his ability to stabilize a lot of this team's plays, and I agree. I think him being here definitely helps. I think it does take away from some of the impact that some of these other players have had to just say that River has completely fixed this team's macro and shot calling. I think he's definitely a big part of it, but there are other players that I want to give a big, up to in that regard, Ayla in particular. But for River, I mean, he's clearly one of the best junglers in North America. He has solidified himself at the top of that ranking, and I really don't think he's going to waver from that anytime soon. River and Quid as a mid-jungle duo is like LCS title worthy. I just don't know if they have the consistency everywhere else. I think a lot of people are going to see the Sniper ranking at B and think that that's too low. I get it. Like, I totally understand Sniper had some really awesome moments, and he was an all-pro for me in the spring split. He was a top 3 top laner, but it is worth noting that a lot of these positions did get better in the offseason. I said that last time in the Shopify section with, Licorice coming into the top lane and Thanatos coming into the top lane. It's just harder to get those spots, and also, Sniper's a really good example of what I mean when I say B is like the same highs as B+, but just a bit more inconsistent. Sniper relies a lot on last pick in the draft. He really likes to have that 1v1 advantage. He's a big dueler and can sometimes be a little bit passive in lanes when he's not necessarily given the best circumstance. That can be positive in a lot of circumstances, but there are games where he'll just fade into the background and not be nearly as effective as the rest of the top laners that kind of do rank above him. I still think he's a super valuable player and can be an all-pro at this level, and he was an all-pro in the spring split. I just don't know if I'm expecting him to be that in an improved top lane right now. Still a very good player. B is certainly, like I said at the beginning, not meant to be an insult towards any players, and that can be said for Ayla as well. I actually value Ayla super highly. He does go down one spot because I think other players just kind of prove themselves a bit more, but support's a really weak position in North America right now. There are not a lot of really proven, consistent supports that have been dominant both this year and last year. Like the track record for a lot of these supports has not been great, and so Ayla making a lot of strides, making a lot of leaps, in my opinion, in the spring split was really welcome. I've always been high on Ayla. People who have followed the channel will know that. I thought that he was the big breakthrough star when he was brought up alongside Busio. I thought Ayla was the better prospect. Obviously, Busio was in a bit of a better situation. Ayla was in kind of a disaster situation on FlyQuest. Couldn't even really play with that team for a majority of the year, and so things were not working out for him, but he's been given kind of a third chance after Evil Geniuses here on 100 Thieves. He was really good on Evil Geniuses, though, a lot better than he gets credit for, and he's been very, very, very important towards how 100T wants to play the game. Because Meech is such a weak side AD carry, even though he is kind of a strong side AD carry, we'll talk about that in a second, it means Ayla actually has more responsibility on him than the traditional support would at this level. So really like him. I think he could even go up against supports, a very breakthroughable position. There is very much a hole in that role that I think, if you're really good, you can kind of jump up to number 1 or number 2 if you have a really good split. The last player to talk about is Meech. He is going to rank as the lowest player here, not because he's bad by any means. B-, again, like that's the same grade I gave Tactical, and in fact, Meech comes in one spot above Tactical in terms of what I'm expecting. They play almost opposite roles. Tactical very much kind of the resource carry, the guy on Immortals, whereas Meech is definitely much more of the to go play Senna and go kind of chill out, or at least that's what he was in the spring split for this team. He is very valuable, and honestly, he impressed me a lot in that role in the spring split. He was not a low resource player in tier 2. In fact, he was a very high resource player in tier 2, so to see him kind of transition into being more of that, just play Senna and just scale into the late game role, it was very impressive for me. Being able to survive in the 2v2 and generally be strong in that phase of the game, I think was very valuable to 100 Thieves as well. And Meech has the upside to kind of grow even more than this. The problem I've always had with Meech was his inconsistency down in tier 2. He would have some of the best games of any AD carry at that level and then also just completely run it in some other games. He didn't have those inconsistencies, but he also didn't have those highs in the spring split. It's always kind of interesting to see where you want to find that balance, where you want to still have those dominant games, you want to still be able to pop off, but you don't want it to be at the cost of, consistency game over game. So Meech still attempting to find that balance, I think, is something I'm going to continue to watch. But again, 6 upwards are all really good teams. You don't really have bad teams in comparison to the rest of this level anymore. Like, River and Quid are a championship caliber mid-jungle duo. Sniper can definitely be a guy that completely emerges in the top lane with his mechanical skill. And Meech and Ayla could be a very strong weak side bot in particular if they want to go in that direction. But 100 Thieves just need to kind of prove that. I'm expecting some regression from some of these players, specifically Sniper and Meech. I don't think they'll be quite as good as they were in the spring split. Even someone like Quid, I don't know if he'll be an MVP guy in the spring or in the summer split here. I think it will be close, but I think 100 Thieves will have been ahead of schedule in spring, and I think there'll be a lot more of what we expected here in summer. Then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings. This is a team that is actually moving up from their performance in the spring split, even without making any roster changes. I just imagine that they are going to be a bit more consistent. I would be shocked if they had the kind of underperformance they had. Once again, it's NRG. It's last year's summer split champions. I do have them coming in at number 5. I would feel very weird keeping them at number 6. I just do not think they're the 6th best team in the league. I know that there were some things that went wrong for this team, but honestly, going back and rewatching some of their tape outside of their playoff series, I think they looked really fine. Like, generally, I think there were positives to this team. You got some underperformances from players that are crucial, pretty integral towards this team's success that I think you're kind of waiting to see if they can figure it out. But really, this team's issue was not their good games. It was their bad games. It was their inconsistency. It was their inability to play well game after game after game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Dokla in the top lane, Contracts in the jungle, Palafox in the mid lane, FBI at AD carry, and Huhi at support. There's nobody on this team that I would consider a glaring weakness. I think that's something that I really value when it comes to energy. There was a reason they came in number 2 in my preseason power rankings. I thought they upgraded in the offseason, bringing Huhi in to replace Ignar. FBI and Huhi have their history as a bot lane duo, and Huhi, I think, is a better player than Ignar is, and that kind of played out to be true. If there was one part of the map that was a strength for energy throughout a majority of the regular season, it was bot lane, especially with a lot of other bot lanes being kind of inconsistent. I don't think they were quite as good as, what I could have anticipated, but Huhi was only slightly worse than he was on Golden Guardians, and FBI was FBI. He's been the same player basically every single split that he's played in NA, especially after that breakout originally on Golden Guardians. And so I really don't feel bad about these players at all. Huhi, actually, maybe shockingly, is still going to come in as my number 1 support. Support's just a position where I don't really feel super confident about anybody in that role right now. He's going to be a B+, and he comes in at number 1 in the role. This might feel kind of weird and low, but I just don't know who else would take that spot. There are definitely some other candidates, and there are other players, namely Core JJ, that I think people are going to fight for. But honestly, I think Huhi was better than Core in the regular season. He wasn't my first team All-Pro, Busio was, but Busio also has his own inconsistencies, as we saw in some pretty pivotal series. And so I don't know, everybody's got something to prove in the support position. I've talked about it a lot in this video already. I don't think anybody in that role is guaranteed to be a superstar or a super good player. Huhi has the track record that leads me to believe that he's going to be fine, and honestly, this bot lane was generally fine, and I think some people overlook that. FBI is just a good player. He is the definition of a B+. You know exactly what you're going to get out of FBI on a split-to-split basis. He's going to be one of the upper tier AD carries. Maybe you have a couple of games every once in a while where he doesn't do super hot, but that's North America. That's not an FBI problem. In relation to a lot of the other AD carries and really just players in North America, in the LCS, he is one of the most consistently great and really solid players and carries in the entire region. He will win lane really consistently. He's really solid in team fights. He doesn't make critical errors, especially when the rest of his team has leads. He's not losing you games. He is valuable, and I think generally that is really good for energy. I think FBI and Huhi were not the problem in the spring split. The rest of this roster, the energy core, was kind of of the problem here. The CLG core, if you really want to call it that, was a bit more of the problem. I think more specifically, it was the solo laners that I was concerned about. Contracts, I think, was generally Contracts. I think for the most part, he was honestly fine, especially going back and rewatching a lot of their games. Of all the players whose opinions I feel better about going into the split, I think Contracts is the one that I probably undervalued the most at the time when doing weekly reviews. Going back and watching a lot of his tape, he was actually pretty good in the spring split. A lot of the good traits that we saw from Contracts in previous years were still there. He just didn't have the same kind of pressure, winning lanes, if you will, to be able to capitalize on. I think for the most part, Contracts really relies a lot on his laners doing well, and they did not do well. And I think Contracts with a better situation would still be fine. Still gonna get a B because he is Contracts. He is super inconsistent. But any given game, he can pop off, and, you know, number 5 is certainly not meant to be an insult. Jungle, like I said, got better in the offseason for sure. But again, it was the solo laners that concerned me. Palafox, I think, took a step back into kind of what he had been in previous years, which is a bit more of an inconsistent player. Not that he was bad. I don't want to try and sit here and say that he completely ran games for this team, because I don't believe that to be true. But one of the things that really was super exciting about Palafox in 2023 is that he had always had those really good games for CLG, but he would also have a couple of really bad games every split, and you just wanted to see him clean it up. I was still a big fan of his. I was still somebody who really pushed for him to be an all-pro caliber guy in 2022, but 2023 felt like the culmination of him growing as a carry in the mid lane and really kind of becoming one of NA's best mids. He felt a lot more like 2022 Palafox than he did 2023 Palafox in the spring split, where those good games are still there. He's still able to pop off. Mechanically speaking, he's still just going to have matchups where he wins because he is so talented, and especially here in NA. There are some mid laners that just can't keep up with him. There are some players that just aren't going to be on the same level as him in that sense, but when he does lose, he loses really hard, and I think that was, again, more apparent in spring, and I think he just needs to clean that up. He's going to fall to number 5. Again, a lot of mid laners, you know, playing really well here, getting, you know, pretty high rankings. You know, Quid moving up to number 2. You've got Quad entering the league. Like, Palafox, unfortunately, is going to fall because of that, and I think, generally speaking, I'm still open to the idea of him being a top 2, top 3 mid laner if everything were to go right, but the inconsistencies really are bothering me at this point, and I think that really culminates with Dokla in the top lane, who quite frankly was not all that good. Like, he was a problem for this team for a lot of the spring split. I know I tend to scapegoat top laners maybe a bit more than other analysts do. That's something I've tried to be cognizant of, and I really try to go back and check and make sure I'm not just like, oh, tank die, that mean player bad, right? I really don't want that to be my analysis, but it's really hard to watch Dokla's laning phases and not feel like he was significantly worse in spring than he had been really at any point in the last 2 years, including in his time in Academy. This was just not the Dokla we had grown to kind of recognize and appreciate. He needs to get back into form. I think he is such an integral part towards this team's mid and late game plan, like ability to front-to-back team fight, that his lack of production in the spring split really cost them. I think if Dokla, Palafox get back on track, I think this team can still be a borderline top 2, top 3 team. I think we're still in that range of teams that can make it there. I think top 4 feels a lot more, you know, obvious in terms of how they end up winning. I think Energy needs bounce backs from multiple players, which is definitely much more of a question, but maybe it's a snowball situation. Maybe if you get, you know, Palafox back on track and starting to carry games, maybe Dokla starts to get a bit more consistent. Maybe you get more out of Contracts because the lanes are winning now. Like, I could see a world in which the train just starts rolling the moment that one of these players starts playing better individually, but right now there are just a few too many questions, even if I believe in the bot lane more than most, for me to rank this team above number 5. But that brings us to the top 4 teams here in the LCS, and from this point onwards, I do think that all 4 of these teams could conceivably win the LCS. I think it really is more wide open than it has been in a lot of years, and to me, it's by far the most wide open region in terms of who could be considered the favorites. Hell, anybody from 6 up, I think, could theoretically win the LCS, but really, I think the top 4 are going to be considered favorites for it. Coming in at number 4 for me, just because they are unproven as a unit, it is going to be Dignitas. I think the upside of this team is ridiculously high. I might even be underrating them in terms of their individual skill levels, but the problem is you just have no idea how a team that has never played together is going to operate and is going to function until you see them on the Rift. I think the things that I'm really excited about, it feels like this team has a very good core identity in terms of the players that they have selected. They clearly wanted to play together. A lot of them have played together before, and also I think they have a very good balance in terms of play styles on this team. Typically speaking, when you see a lot of, you know, big name teams, they struggle in one one way or another, either because you have, too many mouths to feed, too many carries, too many players that are used to having high resource situations. But alternatively, you also have problems like 2022 Team Liquid, where you bring in this super team of Hansama and Bjergsen, and you're really looking to like make this big name roster, but all of them have actually been really good in supporting roles, and all of them aren't really high resource players, and you struggle with the opposite thing of not really knowing where exactly to put your resources. This happened with Dignitas last year when they brought in Santorin and Jensen, a mid-jungle duo that was about as passive as you could possibly get, and neither of them were really able to play the style that got the most out of them individually as players. I think the lucky thing for Dignitas is playstyle-wise, I really like the fit between these five. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Licorice in the top lane, Spica in the jungle, Jensen in the mid lane, Sven at AD carry, and Isles at support. I really like all five of these players. In fact, I think at times all five of them are underrated in their positions. We'll talk about the players that are a little bit more known first. I'm actually going to start with Isles because he's the one player that's actually staying on this team from last split. Isles was very sneakily one of the best supports in the entire league, in the entirety of the LCS. Tomo and Isles were one of, if not the single best bot lane in the regular season in terms of actually establishing pressure in lane, 2v2, like getting resources, and Isles was a big part of that. He has actually been a super underrated player for a long time here in NA. He was super good in OS, obviously back in the day was imported into Cloud9 as kind of their future-proofing option at support, never really needed him. They moved Sven to support, and Isles was just kind of stuck in purgatory, was playing in tier 2 for a little bit, was getting options even after the academy system, but was actually given a shot mostly here on Dignitas, and he really made the most of it. I think some people are going to see the B grade and actually say that's too high. Originally, I had him at a B-, but I just don't think he's a B- player. I know he comes in as my number 6 support, which is the lowest on this team, and, not somebody that I think is entirely proven, but the upside of Isles is top 2, top 3. Hell, he could be number 1 by the end of the split. I think he's talented enough to do so. I don't think he's a star, but I don't think you need to be a star right now to be the number 1 support in the LCS. He has the potential to really kind of make a breakthrough. I think it's more likely that he ends up just kind of being a good support. I don't want to say the weak link of the team, but certainly the one that is getting the least amount of publicity. I think that is the most likely outcome for Isles, but I still think he will be valuable to them. I certainly don't think him being the one remaining member of Dignitas is going to be a negative that they couldn't get a bigger name there. I think that he actually fits this team really well. And then the other kind of known quantities for me, Jensen returning here for Dignitas. I feel very confident that Jensen is going to be almost identical to what he was on FlyQuest this past split. Maybe he won't have the same amount of resources because, I just don't know if Spica's going to come back and be what Inspired was in the jungle, but one of the things that made Jensen so bad on Dignitas last year, quite frankly, was that he had to be this hyper carry. He had to come in and actually be the best player on the team, and that's just not who Jensen is at this point in his career. At one time, 2017, he could have been that guy that stepped in for Cloud9 and was an MVP level player. He should have won multiple MVPs in that time frame, but it's just not who he is anymore. He is much better playing that, supportive role, being able to farm up and then team fight in the late game. Think someone like Larson, except a lot more consistent in that phase, and certainly with a better team around him, he can perform at a similar level to what Larson did in the LEC during Rogue's title run. I think that that's a pretty valuable thing for Dignitas to have. He's a B+, very consistent in his role, and again, the reason I'm so excited is because the top side of this map is so strong, and they are both kind of resource-heavy players, which I do think helps Dignitas here. We'll talk about Spica first, because we talked about Jensen. Spica's not Santorin. I think him coming in here to Dignitas to be kind of a primary facilitator, an early game maestro for them is actually going to be very positive for Spica. Overall, I am very cautiously putting him at number 4 in terms of my jungle rankings, but I think he could very much exceed that ranking. There have been multiple times throughout his career where he has been better than that. There have been times throughout his career where he's been worse than that. I think, even the MVP season, I thought he was a little bit overrated, and then it's funny because that last year on TSM, the end of 2022, I thought he was underrated. I thought that he wasn't getting the credit he actually deserved on that team, so a lot to talk about when it comes to Spica. I think B+ is the most accurate grade you can give him. He's going to be a very valuable player to your team. Maybe not an MVP, maybe not a superstar, but he's really good. His early games are really solid, and honestly, he can be hyper consistent so long as he is locked in and in the zone. He wasn't that for FlyQuest, but FlyQuest had a ton of problems last year. I think he's going to be a positive for this team overall. And then Licorice on the top side, he's going to be the highest graded player on this team, and some might be shocked to see he's still going to come in as my number 1 top laner, and some people might wonder why that's fair. he was teamless in the spring split, and he comes in as my number 1 top laner, but he was far and away the number 1 top laner the last time he played at the end of last year for Golden Guardians. It really wasn't even all that close. He was really, 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 really good for that team, and one of the things that gives me confidence that he is going to be, what he was for GG is the fact that when he was talking about what changed between him, between Cloud9 and Golden Guardians and why that stretch wasn't as successful, he talked about losing his confidence, losing the ability to go out there and make the plays that he knows are good, and kind of relying on neutral plays or going for plays that aren't as good because he was kind of, force conditioned into going for them on these bad teams. Well, he really got his confidence back on Golden Guardians. That was one of the things he talked about the most, and I imagine that will carry over to a team like this. I imagine those good plays are still going to be made, and he has the mechanics to back that up. Honestly, going into the split, he should be considered the number 1 top laner, in my opinion, although I think it is very close. Some people are going to be upset by that, but that's just my personal opinion. And then finally, Sven. He's going to be the last player to talk about here. I actually feel pretty confident that Sven's going to be really good for this team in the AD carry role. I know he's role swapping back to ADC after spending a ton of years as a support in Cloud9 system and for C9, but honestly, he was always better as an AD carry. Like, support, it always felt like he was trying to adapt to, figuring out the position, and it felt like it took him a bit of time to get a lot of things under his control. He still struggled in the mid game as a support, but as an ADC, he was always one of the best in North America, and I honestly feel like he's going to get right back to that. I'm going to give him a B+ grade. I think that might undersell the performances that he could possibly give. I'm really high on Sven, and I think there's a real chance that he could come back in as an ADC and prove why he was one of the best in that role before he role swapped. I really do think that highly of Sven's ADC tape, even the last time that he played in the LCS. So I feel pretty good about this team. I know this might be higher than some other people are putting them because they've never played together, and because some people want to be cautious, and some people really want to hang on to the fact that 100 Thieves was really good, or that Energy might bounce back, and so some people are putting those teams above Dignitas. I just don't think they're talented enough to be able to be expected to be better than Dig. If Dig completely falls and collapses, like, it happens, right? We've never seen this team play. There is a chance that they're just not good enough, but I think on paper, there's just no way that I can sit here and say I expect Dignitas to be worse than Energy and 100 Thieves. I don't expect them to be worse. I expect them to be better. I think they expect themselves to be better, which is why I rank them at number 4 and why I think they will be a team that ends up competing for a title. But that brings us to our top 3 teams, and these are the top 3 that I think a lot of people will have. I've seen one of these teams ranked a lot lower than, what I have them, but we'll talk about that when we get there. That's not going to be now. Coming in at number 3, it's one of the MSI representatives and one of the finalists from the previous split. It's FlyQuest for me. And I think some people might see this again as too low. I think FlyQuest has pretty unanimously been seen in the top 2 in terms of people's power rankings. I think the addition of Quad could potentially be a massive upgrade to this team, but there's just a lot unknown about this team to me, and I think especially with how they ended up performing at MSI and some of the problems that I think got exposed by that run, there are things I'm concerned about. There were things in the playoffs that I was concerned about, and I get it. This team got first place in the regular season, second place in spring, but I don't know if I have that same kind of confidence in them in the summer split, and I'll kind of talk about why. Their lineup is looking like Whippo in the top lane, Inspired in the jungle, Quad in the mid lane, Masu at AD carry, and Busio at support. This is essentially just a more mechanically intense version of what they were in spring. I think obviously bringing Quad in to replace Jensen, it's a bit of a stylistic difference. In fact, I think it's one of the biggest stylistic differences you could have possibly done. You're going from a player who is known for being a low resource, kind of supportive mage mid lane player who loves to team fight, loves to be, a part of a team and really propel his jungler in particular to better positions. You're going from that to a player in the mid lane who's, I would say, biggest weakness is their ability to play with the rest of the team, who's really struggled at that, at a bigger level in the past in the LCK. I think it's certainly going to be an adjustment period for this team, which is why I do have them lower. I wouldn't be surprised if they struggled a bit more in the regular season, but like I said, the mechanical upside of adding Quad is so much higher than if you add Jensen here. Quad mechanically could easily be the best mid laner. Quite frankly, he's going to come in day 1, and I guess we're talking about him first. He's going to come in day 1 and be a top 5 player in the LCS in terms of mechanics, in terms of his ability to 1v1, in terms of his ability to go toe-to-toe with everybody else in the region. He is the number 1 mid laner in terms of who I expect to dominate dominate lane phase, to have the best laning stats. I really do believe that. He only comes in as a B+ for me because there are actual concerns when it comes to Quad. I've seen pretty exclusively praise for Quad going into this split, and I understand why, because he absolutely obliterated the NACL. He was so much better than everybody else that he was laning against that it really was a no-brainer for them to promote him to their starting mid lane position. I still think that's absolutely the right decision, and, you know, just because I'm moving them down here doesn't mean that I don't think that this is the right move for FlyQuest in the long run. I do believe this is the right move for FlyQuest. I think this makes their team better, but ignoring Quad's weaknesses I think wouldn't necessarily be fair. And maybe, I've talked about this before, maybe I'm just a little bit burned because I was a big fan of Quad and I followed him so heavily when he was a prospect in the LCK, when he came up through DRX's system. That 2021 DRX team is one of my favorites of all time, and he was the starting mid laner as Solka on that team. I was super hyped about him. I talked about him a ton on this channel. He became a bit of a channel darling, and then he kind of disappeared off the face of the planet. He went and played in Turkey for a bit, and then eventually got a starting spot again on Nongshim last year, and honestly was horrible. He was really bad for Nongshim. He showed a lot of the deficiencies that he showed on DRX, except he didn't really have that mechanical dominance. Like on DRX in 2021, he was a really raw player, very, very good in lane, but not really good at much else. On Nongshim, he continued to be fine as a laner, was certainly not exceptional, especially in the LCK where mid lane is paramount. Like, you have to be able to lane at a high level to be an LCK mid laner. He was okay, about average in terms of that department, but Quad's problem was always that, honestly, his macro was horrible in the LCK. When you go back and watch that tape, he is just not playing with his jungle. He's not taking good skirmishes. He's not paying attention to the map. It didn't really feel like he was all that good in that part of the game, which is why I want to preface with maybe I'm just a bit biased about him. I don't think his tape in the NACL is as bad as maybe I would make it out to be, but he definitely didn't show that he improved entirely in that area. He never really got tested in terms of his ability to play the map and to play macro, because everybody won on FlyQuest Challengers basically all year long. Like, their top lane was winning constantly, their jungle was winning constantly, and he was winning constantly. And so there were never these situations where he had to, like, be super proactive in the mid game, where it was kind of dependent on him making the right reads coming out of that mid lane role. It never really became that for him, and so I'm just not sure that he's going to be a high level player in that regard. But again, I can't stress enough, from a pure mechanics perspective, he's a top 5 player in the LCS right now. Like, one-on-one in the mid lane, I don't think anybody's going to be able to go toe-to-toe with him, maybe other than Jojo Pune. He's like the one-on-one mid laner that I think has the mechanics to keep up with Quad, but even then, maybe Quad's better. So there are positives to promoting him. Again, I don't want it to seem like it's a negative, but I do want to explain my thoughts on him as a player, and I do think that there are areas for him to continuously improve on, and I would really like to see that improvement before I just say that he's the best mid laner in the LCS before ever playing a game. But there are other positives on this team. Bwipo and Inspired, I think, are definitely positives coming in from the spring split. Bwipo was the best top laner in the regular season. I don't really think that carried over too much into the playoffs. He was okay in the playoffs, certainly wasn't like a dominating presence, and quite frankly, he was a bit disappointing at MSI. I think there are real concerns there. I'm not going to rank him too low. He's still going to come in as the number 3 top laner for me. He proved enough to prove that he deserves to be on that list, but Licorice coming in, taking that number 1 spot, and another player who I just think is slightly more consistent, coming in at number 2 ahead of him. I think that those are fair assessments. We'll get to those when we get there, but Bwipo at 3 might even be a bit high. Again, you know, Thanatos is coming in, so potentially that could be another spot that Bwipo gets knocked down. I think the competition on the top side of the map is going to be harsher at the top of the standings, and Bwipo might suffer because of that, but also he way overperformed my expectations in the spring split. Then Inspired, I'm just super high on him. He's going to be the only player on this team coming in as an A-graded player. He's going to get an A-. There are flaws to his game. He's not exactly the most consistent player of all time. Like, there are going to be some games, especially when he gets behind early, that he's just not quite as great, but he is the best objective controller in the West, and I think that's a pretty clear thing to say. He has a track record of being very good basically at whatever stop he's on. It doesn't really seem like he's super team reliant. He is very individualistically strong, but in a way that I think is replicable across multiple different team styles. I don't think the fact that he's losing Jensen, a player who does like playing for jungle, and gaining Quad, who's a little bit more of a resource carry, I don't think that's going to be a problem for him. I think it's certainly something to monitor. He's been used to playing with people like Larson and Jensen, but he's also played with Jojo Pune, and I think Quad could be a relatively similar style in that regard. A very good late game team fighter. That's where he's going to find most of his magic on things like Viego. So Inspired's a good player. I've talked about him a lot on this channel. You know, number 2 feels like the right spot for him. If I do have a concern about FlyQuest, I wasn't super sold on the bot lane. I think Busio had a good split, but I don't think he had a great split. I've always been a bit lower on Busio, not in like a hugely negative way. Obviously, I still really like Busio, and he's actually going to move up above Ayla, who I had him below going into this year because he was just better than Ayla. He was my first team all-pro support in the spring split, but that was more so out of like lack of options than it was like, oh, I feel great about Busio. Bot lane was fine generally for this team, but mostly it was like every support feels like they are underperforming right now, and Busio was the only one on a team where it feels like he's actually doing something, so he got a lot of credit for that. I still want to see him be kind of that game breaker out of the support position. He's never really been that at the LCS level. Again, I think he has the potential. I'm a little bit lower on him. I think this is more accurate towards where he's at, like the top of B tier, lower B+, like somewhere in that range, but I still think he is a positive to the team overall. He's not dragging the grade down, and Masu is also not dragging the grade down, but I have more questions about Masu than I thought I would have coming out of the NACL last split. I had him as high as number 3 in my pre-split power rankings in the spring. Like going into the year, I thought he was going to immediately be one of the best AD carries at this level. It just didn't really happen. If there was a part of the team that definitely felt like it wasn't clicking on all cylinders, it was Masu. Now, he wasn't horrible. I'm not trying to say he was losing games for this team by any means, but he honestly wasn't winning all that much isolated. Like, he really relied on the top side of the map to win. I just want to see more out of Masu. For a player who dominated the NACL in a similar way to what Quad did, you know, what we said about Quad kind of applies to Masu, where he was so much better than everybody else that he was playing against that the expectation was he was going to come in and be one of the most mechanically gifted players basically from day one. That just didn't necessarily happen. He took his lumps as a rookie in his first split. I think it will get better in the second split. His upside is just so high. If you can get him on track, like he can be the best AD carry in North America this split. He has that kind of mechanical upside, but it was inconsistent, which is why he's in that B tier instead of that B+ tier. Because game to game, there was a lot of variance, a lot more variance than I think a lot of people would like to make out for a prospect that rightfully is talked about a lot. But bot lane's I'm not sold on it being one of the best in the entire league. I think it's reasonable to imagine topside just has more competition for that upper slot this year than what Whippo had in spring. And I don't really know whether or not Quad is going to be able to make the transition perfectly. I think he'll be very good, which is why I have his floor as a B+. Like, I don't think he'll be worse than a B+, but I think a lot of people are saying that he's going to be an A and that he's immediately going to be way, way better for this team than Jensen. I think it might take some time for this team to figure out a playstyle. That would be my anticipation, which is why they fall to 3. But I still imagine this team is going to be good. And honestly, just from a skill perspective, they can compete with anybody in the LCS. And that's going to bring us to our top 2 teams in my LCS power rankings, and I think this is going to be a controversial take. I really haven't had any controversial takes when it comes to my power rankings in other videos. I've been pretty stock standard in terms of where I've put teams, but I really do believe this. Coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be Team Liquid, the defending champions. TL Honda coming in at number 2. That means you know who number 1 is, and that's definitely a controversial take. Couple of things that I want to reiterate, and I'll say this in the number 1 section as well. You know, I'll just name them. Cloud9 is number 1. Like, they are going to come in at number 1, and I'll talk about why I believe that when we get to their section. But there are some things that I want to point out here that I think are relevant. First and foremost, as I said before, I really do believe any of the top 4 teams could be considered favorites. Really, any of the top 3. I think it would be a bit crazy to say Dignitas is the favorite of the league, but anybody in the top 3, I think could be put number 1 in these power rankings, and I could understand. FlyQuest was the best regular season team last year, and really the only times they struggled were in best of 5s where there were some weird circumstances going on, where they underperformed their own play. They got better in the offseason. I could see you putting them at number 1. I could see you putting Team Liquid at number 1 because they are the defending champions. Basically, everybody else is putting Team Liquid at number 1. They just beat Fnatic at MSI. There is a lot of upside and excitement surrounding this team right now. There's also an argument to be made for Cloud9, which I will make in their section. But one of the things that I do want to say, and this is the point I will reiterate in both sections, is that really what sealed the deal for me in putting Team Liquid second is if Team Liquid loses this split, if they get 3rd or 4th, are we going to be looking at that as a major disappointment, or are we going to say that that's them coming back down to earth? It's probably the latter, right? If Team Liquid loses, we're probably going to be like, okay, well, you know, they overperformed in spring, and this was more of the accurate skill level. If Cloud9 loses, again, if they get 3rd or 4th, again, if they end up missing Worlds some way, somehow, are we going to look at that as a disappointment? Yes. Like, the expectation on Cloud9 is higher. Like, Team Liquid could falter in a lot of ways that Cloud9 can't expectationally. And I think that was kind of the pushing point where it's like, why would I say that Team Liquid are expected to be favorites when I don't even think a lot of people really expect them to win again? I think people are putting them first out of like respect for the fact that they won a title and that they beat Fnatic at MSI. Dude, I don't think people really think that Team Liquid is the best team in North America. And so I'm not going to rank them as such. I'm going to rank them where I see them, which is at number 2. I hope all of that makes sense. And also, I really want to point out, they went 7-7 in the regular season. This wasn't some dominant team from spring that I think is just going to regress for no reason. Most of their 2024 so far has been bad. I was really critical of this team in the regular season. I did not think they were a good League of Legends team. I certainly did not think they were a complete League of Legends team. I predicted them in the playoffs to go out in the first round, and obviously that turned out really wrong, and I'll hold my hands up and say that I was wrong there, but there are reasons why I made that prediction. So I don't think this is like definitely going to be the team that we saw over the past couple of months. I'll explain the positives and the negatives though. Their lineup is looking like Impact in the top lane, in the jungle, APA in the mid lane, Yon at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. Of course, no changes. They're the champions, but I hope I've made my case already. I'll try to speed up my player analysis because I don't want this section to be 12 minutes, but we'll start with kind of the core of this team, and I mean that literally in the bot lane. Yon and Core JJ are the best thing that this team has. I know a lot of people are going to look at Impact as their best player, but the reason this team was the LCS champions in spring is Yon and Core. They were the reason this team got over the hump in a meta and in a league where bot lanes were not consistent at all, where basically every major bot lane from another team underperformed, specifically their biggest competition, the top 4 teams last split. 100 Thieves had a weak side bot lane, right? They were better than them. FlyQuest's weakness is their bot lane, even if you want to consider Masu to be better than what I think he was in spring. He's certainly not the strength of that team, and Cloud9's bot lane majorly underperformed. Yon and Core had a uniquely great opportunity to be able to just kind of run their way through that playoff bracket, be in a really good spot, and be able to step it up. And I just don't know if that situation is going to happen again in Summer Split. I don't know if these other bot lanes are going to be as bad as they were in spring. I don't know if you're going to have that much of an advantage. Maybe they will. Maybe they will continue to be the best bot lane in North America by a considerable margin. Again, I think that's a realistic possibility. They both come in at number 2 in their positions for me. I just can't guarantee that. Yon was incredible in spring and really kind of separated himself and really cemented his playstyle. He is the best laner in North America, regardless of role. He is able to dominate in the 2v2 in a way that nobody else is. They were picking Smolder, the double dragon comp for Team Liquid. They were picking Smolder in the bot lane down the stretch for this team because they knew that Yon would win lane anyways, and then he could use that to team fight at a high level. It was that much of an ego check for Yon and Core. Whether they're able to get away with that again in summer, I think is up for debate, but man, did they dominate domestically in the spring split. Core was excellent. I think individually the mechanics were starting to show some concerns, especially in the regular season. There were some engages that he just did poorly. Or some, he failed to peel in some pretty pivotal moments in some team fights in the regular season. Talked about it a lot in the weekly reviews, but for the most part, both of them stepped up when they needed to the most in the playoffs, and they're the biggest reason why Team Liquid won the finals and got to the finals in the first place. So if they can repeat, yeah, Team Liquid's going to be a top 2 team, easy. Impact is, of course, also the positive for this team. Top lane was a really big plus, I would say, generally for TL. Last split, he was an all-pro caliber guy, and he is going to come in as my number 2 top laner. He was the number 1 top laner for me before Licorice, re-entered the league. I think Licorice has more upside as a carry, which is why he gets that number 1 mark, and I think he's also a very good weak side, but Impact is the most stable top laner in the entire league, and I think it's fair to say that it's almost impossible to say that he's not a major positive to this team. Some people might want him in the A's. I can understand that. Honestly, I kind of consider putting him at A-. I think he is that good. But the jungle mid, I think there's reason to believe that, yeah, they were awesome in the playoff run. Is that going to be sustainable for them? They had their problems, and not only in the regular season, but they had their problems in playoffs as well. APA was generally much better in the playoffs than he was in the regular season, but I definitely have consistency question marks when it comes to him. I think both of these players are inconsistent. I think for APA, it's definitely a bit unfortunate. I want him higher than 6, and honestly, he gets that -1. He's better than he was in spring. Like, my opinion of him has gone up, but you have the addition of multiple mid laners that I think are just like, okay, well, where do I put APA? Well, Quid had to jump him because Quid was the MVP and was just better than APA throughout last split. Okay, well, now Quad is in the league, and he's essentially replacing the Dignitas mid laner, Dove, and Of course, Dove was below APA, and now Quad is above APA, because Quad is more mechanically talented, in my opinion, than APA. Well, do I put APA above Palafox? He was maybe just as good as him in the regular season, better than him in the playoffs, but Palafox has a better track record. Like, you can see where it's difficult to find space for APA in the top 5 in terms of mid laners in North America, because there is kind of this influx of talent. Well, APA unfortunately comes in at number 6. I still think he's a good player. Mid lane is a pretty easy position to find, like, good players at the very least in North America right now. Maybe not stars, but good players, and APA is not going to be a negative to this team. I honestly feel pretty good about him, and I feel bad that he moves down. Like I said, less good about. I think that there are positives to Umti's game. There are negatives. I think one of the things that he's cleaned up a lot since coming to North America is being able to play for his laners. He was not like a very versatile player on Bro. We talked about it a lot on the channel, but he was that classic, like, does incredibly well 5 or 6 games per year, and then the other 20 were just not very good. Like, you would look at those 5 games and be like, Umti's so mega stuck on Bro, and then you would watch the other 20 and it's like, well, yes, this is why he's on Bro, because so many games he just actively loses at the LCK level. He wasn't quite that volatile at the LCS level. He was better on things like Maokai and Sejuani, but he still definitely prefers to carry, and he still definitely prefers to play from ahead. And when this team was playing from behind in the regular season, they were awful. Like, Umti was getting absolutely brutalized at playing from behind. APA was never really that great in the regular season. I think that's something to also note. Like, there are real weaknesses. There was a reason this team went 7-7. I know that there's a lot of hype surrounding this team because Jan and Impact in particular, those 2 players were so good in their playoff run and at MSI, but I'm going to be honest, I'm a little bit of a doubter. I don't know if this is going to be repeatable. For, brevity's sake, I do think they should be a top 2 team. This should be a team that makes finals, makes worlds, actually goes, for a push like that. But do I think that they're going to be as dominant as they were in that playoff run as what they could show at MSI? I just don't know. I just don't know if that's going to happen for a full split again. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 team in my power rankings. And my process of elimination, you already know who it is. Hell, I even said it in the previous segment if you skipped here. It's Cloud9, and I know this is going to be a controversial take because this team underperformed basically every expectation in the spring split. They were just barely above 500. They went on this massive losing streak in the middle of the split. They were not able to get the job done in playoffs. They did not even make MSI as the number 2 seed from North America. So many things went wrong for Cloud9. So how can I sit here and say that one change in the top lane going to a player that might be just as good as Fudge day 1, like maybe isn't even like a huge upgrade to Fudge day number 1, like how do I say that that is the number 1 team in the league after what they showed? Well, again, I'm just putting my thoughts out there, but I think they're very comparable in terms of skill to Team Liquid, to FlyQuest. I think that at the very least, they're in the same tier from a mechanical perspective. And when I really sat down and asked myself, okay, who would be more disappointed to miss out on the finals, to miss out on being top 2? Would it be Cloud9 or would it be Team Liquid? The answer is Cloud9. Cloud9's expectations are higher. If they get 3rd, again, it's a disaster. If Team Liquid get 3rd, oh, well, that's natural regression. They overperformed in spring. It's not the case for Cloud9. This is the team that expects to win the LCS, and that's why I have them at number 1, because I expect them to win the LCS. I expect this team to win, and if they lose, it's a bigger disappointment than if Team Liquid loses, for all the reasons I listed on Team Liquid's, section just a second ago. But let's talk about Cloud9. Let's not talk about their relation to the rest of the teams. Let's talk about what they do well, and why I think there is reason to be confident that they will get better. Their lineup is looking like Thanatos in the top lane, Blabber in the jungle, Jojo Pyun in the mid lane, Berserker at AD carry, and Vulcan at support. They still have some of the most elite talent in the entire region. They have most of the A's, and I still believe that all of these players have earned their ranking. The only ones that you can really question are the bot laners, but we'll talk about that in a second. I want to get to the strengths first. If there's one player you cannot question this A grade on, it's Jojo Pyun. There is simply no way to look at what happened in the spring split and say that it was Jojo's fault. I even went back and watched a lot of this tape. He was trying his hardest to 1v9 in a lot of these games. In the games they did win, Jojo was incredible. He was an MVP caliber player for a majority of this split for Cloud9. Like, there is just no conversation. Mechanically speaking, he is ridiculous. He's unlike any mid laner North America has ever produced. He is genuinely able to hold his own against anybody, not only here, but in the world, in a 1v1. Maybe he's not always got the mentality to do so. He will make weird plays every once in a while. He will mess up in the mid game, kind of overreach in some areas, but he's honestly gotten better in that stage. He's gotten better at being a low resource player. I just have so much faith that Jojo JoJo Pune is going to be an MVP caliber player for Cloud9, regardless of what happens on the rest of this roster, that you start there. You start with what is, in my opinion, clearly the best mid laner in the league. And then you move to Blabber in the jungle. And I'm sorry, I will continue to hype up Blabber. I know that he had a bit of a down split, especially towards the back half of the regular season. There were some negatives, I think, to talk about in terms of the games he had there. There was some spirited discussions on whether or not he should have been first team All-Pro versus Inspired. Inspired got it. I think that was the right choice. But Blabber being in that conversation, I think, was justified. There was a stretch of like the first third of the season where it was clear that Blabber was the best jungler in the league, where he was like an MVP favorite, and then things just got worse during their losing streak. Do I think Blabber could get back to that more consistent style? Absolutely, and the track record is there for Blabber as well. It's not like, you know, he has been bad in previous years. For the most part, this guy has just been the best jungler in North America ever since he's been given a full-time opportunity in 2019, really? Like 2020, like that era? Has he ever not been the best jungler since then? I don't really know. So Blabber, JoJo, I feel good about. They had good chemistry when they were winning. I think it could get even better as this year continues to go along. Berserker and Vulcan, I'm a little bit more concerned about. I'm opting on the side of optimism for Berserker. He's going to stay at number 1, but only just barely. I think if there was other AD carries that like really were like, oh yeah, you're a top guy. Like if Yon had another split before this where he played as well as he did in spring, I would have been pretty comfortable putting Yon above Berserker, but nobody can match Berserker's upside. Like it's just not even close. If Berserker is on, he is the best AD carry in North America, even if he didn't show it at all in spring. He was not good. He was, you know, the one player that I was really concerned about because he did not play well at all in spring. But again, if he even gets remotely back to where he has been in North America previously, he was the best player in NA by far at the start of the year. So I want to give him cautious optimism. He was an A+. He's going down to an A-. That's further than both Blabber and JoJo are dropping because he did play worse than them. But again, I can't put him in the Bs. He's simply too much upside. If he does bad again, you know, catch me giving up on Berserker in terms of what he could be with this bot lane. But it's just too early for that for me. And then Vulcan, he is the player that I'm most giving up on in terms of the rest of this team. As you can see, he has the lowest grade. He comes in as a B-graded support. He is the lowest graded player on this team. This is now, 2 years in a row where he has just not played particularly well. He wasn't really all that great on Evil Geniuses. He was actually okay on EG in the spring of last year, but then you move into, you know, obviously EG blows it up. He goes to FlyQuest. That team is a disaster. He's one of the biggest reasons why that team was bad. He was horrible for Fly. And then Cloud9 in spring, he was horrible for Cloud9 in spring. He was a net negative on this team by a large margin. He's just not trending in the right direction. And that's why I am much more cautious about Vulcan. I think if there's any player that I am kind of willing to give up on this team, it probably is him. He comes in as the number 3 support because, again, support's just not solidified, like right above Busio, right above Ayla. Like, would I love to say that these players are better? Yes. And do I think they were better in spring? Yes, but it's Vulcan. Like, you want to hope he can turn it around. The snap of the fingers, like, he is number 5. Like, literally one bad game and he's number 5 on this list. But I want to see what this team looks like in summer before I just completely trash Vulcan's rating, although it is close. And then you have a new top laner. Fudge is out. Thanatos is in. I think a lot of people are going to look at this as some superstar, you know, addition, because Thanatos has been talked about super highly in terms of LCK challengers. I think a lot of analysts have talked about him as if he is going to be kind of the big game breaker that NA has been looking for, or even that like Korea has been looking for. People have been saying DK should start him for years. I've watched the tape, and I am a little bit lower on Thanatos, and I know that's a weird thing to say for a Cloud9 team that I'm much higher on. The upside's there. Like, mechanically, he is absolutely there, but honestly, there are games where he has less of an impact than he should have, given his circumstances. He's really good at generating resources. 1v1, he's going to be a nightmare to have to play into, but his mid-games are slow, like, a lot slower than you would expect from somebody who's hyped up as, like, one of the best prospects in the world. Like, he's just a good player in that phase of the game. If he can unlock that, or if he comes over here to North America and the laning is even more dominant, if he's just so much better than every other top laner 1v1, then I could absolutely imagine him being number 1 by the end of this. But this is a player who's never played at a top level. I think 4 is actually pretty generous in terms of my grade. He is going to get a B+, because honestly, I would just be shocked if that mechanical floor was anything other than valuable for this team, especially because it's not like you can just put resources into shutting him down. You have Blabber and JoJo and Berserker on this team. You have to pay attention to all of them or else they can beat you. Thanatos is going to get a lot more open looks on this team, if you will, a lot more free laning phases than you would naturally expect from a player of his caliber. I think that will help him in his development, but he does have things he needs to clean up. Very similar to what I talked about with Quad. All that being said, Cloud9 still is the most talented team in the league for me. They are the team that should be expected to win this split. I don't care if they underperformed in spring. If they don't go to the finals, if they don't win the finals, like, you can't look at this as anything other than a disappointment. We talked about this as the best super team NA has ever seen in the preseason. They should still be that. They are still in the conversation for that. They've not lived up to it yet, but I can't give up on this team until I see them fall at the very end. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS Summer Split 2024 Primer and Power Rankings video. We did it. We got through all 8 teams. We talked about every single starting player in the league. I ranked them all. I gave them all grades. There is something that you are upset over. I'm sure of it. There is something that you really do not agree with. Let me know what it is down in the comment section below. Again, just be civil about it. I'm happy to have those conversations. I'm not some kind of analyst that hates contentious opinions. I'm more than happy to hear out anybody that mega disagrees with me. Cloud9 should be number 6 and 100 Thieves should be number 2. Go ahead, talk your shit down in the comment section below. I'm totally fine with that. Just be respectful about it. Understand that we can all have different opinions, and that is okay. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the LCS every single week on this channel. The NACL primer video is coming out either later tonight or tomorrow. I'm not exactly sure when that's going to be coming out, but hopefully soon. And of course, you know, we're covering all of the other major regions as well. LEC, LCK, LPL, every single week on this channel. Hit subscribe if you are interested in that kind of content, and hit the bell if you want to be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.